Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature. Today's topic, Counter-Cartography, Remapping the World Through Stories. Presented by NatHab Expedition Leader Kristina Disney, and joining us on the phone, anthropologist Liam Campbell. I'm your host, Rob Mess. Thank you so much for joining us today. Take it away, Kristina.
Thank you so much, Rob. And hello, everyone. Thanks for tuning back in. I am very excited to have a guest today. I haven't brought anyone else along in a while. And I would say it was through some very interesting sort of circular ways that we got to know each other. But just before I leave this, our opening page here, I wanted to actually take time to look at the quote that I've placed on the screen there, which is that stories are change. And it's such a simple quote that I can't track down who, maybe gets to lay claim to saying it first. But it's one that I think about very, very often. And it's this notion, it's not that stories are about change or that stories cause change. It's that they really are, right? And as you may have noticed already, I quite enjoy storytelling. I think about it very much highly as at least my favorite art form. But I think it just goes so far into everything that is sort of good and true about humans. So I'm very, very excited to have our webinar today be focused around stories and the power that stories hold. And so, yeah, folks, as you know, or at least for some who might be joining us for the first time today, I've been a guide with NatHab since about 2018. And we're going to bring a non-guide in, someone who have had the chance to sort of overlap with in the academic field of sorts, as it turns out. So it is my very great pleasure to introduce Liam Campbell, who's also studying at the University of Victoria. And he's going to teach us, I think, so certainly he's already taught me quite a bit about Kutka's counter-cartography, and then he's going to share that with all of you. But I'm just going to open the floor to Liam so that he can introduce you all himself.
Hello, everybody. So I'm joining you from the phone today. My computer has decided not to cooperate with us today. So my name is Liam Campbell. I am a Chornitum, or a settler of Irish, Scottish, and Welsh descent. I was born and raised in Quanlandanant Ancochan territory, in a place often confused as Whitehorse, Yukon. And I've been living down in Victoria in Lekwungen-speaking and Husainich territories for the last 2 years, pursuing both my undergraduate and my master's degree in anthropology. So I'm here to talk to you folks about stories quite often, and as part of my own practice here, it's really important to bring our own stories into this work and into our own introductions. Unfortunately, I don't have a ton of my own personal family stories that go into deep time. However, that hasn't really discouraged us from working with these stories. Yeah, that's me in a nutshell.
Lovely. Well, we're very excited to have you, and I'm very excited for some of the stories we could share. I wanted to tie in how Liam and I's paths, or maybe how our stories crossed over. So, for folks who kind of tuned in the last month and a half, we did a big series on a fellow named Georg Steller, who wore many hats. He was a doctor, a naturalist, mineralogist. But the way that I came to first know him was because there are a lot of animals that bear his name. There's the Steller jay, which you can find here in the Pacific Northwest, the Steller sea eagle, the Steller sea lion. One that we have never had the chance to see, at least for many generations, is the Steller sea cow. That's what the drawing is. That's from his original notes back in 1741 on the top left there. And those have gone extinct, unfortunately. But his description of their lifestyle, of their ecology, and how they fit into it, that's the only account that we have of them. And so I got really fascinated by not only the animals, but the person behind these stories. And so for those who joined, right, we did that deep dive. We looked into that first voyage he had with Vitus Bering, right, like the Bering Sea, and how the journey that he took across, the people that he met, the animals, the ecosystems that he encountered. And so my focus, as far as the overlap with Steller, was more or less the portion of his life that occurred at sea. And through some of my own research, sort of parallel to the work that I do with NatHab, I also was starting to dig into some qualitative methods, and I had the chance to meet a professor named Tanya, and sort of taking her class, she found out that I was interested in Steller, and she said, well, I so happen to work with a researcher who's working with his stories as well, which was a crazy overlap because I'd only dug into this so recently. And so, again, I'd sort of been looking at his marine exploits and the information that he gathered from there. But if we back up for anyone who remembers the story, so he gets hired to be the naturalist on all of these explorations in Eastern Russia, but he had to make the journey all the way across from St. Petersburg, all across Russia. And so along the way, he was an amazing collector of stories, of knowledge, fascinated by all of the people, of all the places that he met along the way. And so that journey that he took, if you're having trouble sort of seeing those blue and red lines there, it's very comparable to where the Trans-Siberian Railway is now. Just trying to give some people some context if you wanted to think about that voyage that he would have went on. And so I happened to run into Liam sitting at the anthropology conference, or more so got directed towards him. And he started to tell me sort of a combination of the story that has captured his attention, as well as how his own story has fit in there. So Liam, if you don't mind maybe recounting some of those details.
Sure. I just want to clarify that we are on slide 9.
We are on slide 9.
Cool. So what we see here is one of Steller's maps of Kamchatka. And so in fall 2021, I met Dr. Tatiana Degay. She's an Edelman scholar and professor at UVic here, and she's my supervisor and mentor. And at the beginning of the semester, I went up to her, and she was just freshly moved here too, down to Victoria, and I said, I want a job. And she said, I don't have one for you yet, but get back to me. And so come January, she hired me as her research assistant, and she said that she wanted some help mapping out Steller's account of Kamchatka. And so this map itself is from his History of Kamchatka, the English translation. And I worked on it for a good long time. In summer of last year, in 2023, we started work with another oral history from her people. So Edelman people are Indigenous people whose territory is in Kamchatka. And so we started working on a film that involves a bit of the mapping work that we've been doing together. And we have continued this mapping work up until present as we are starting to push it more in realms of like art and revitalization as opposed to just sort of drawing lines on paper. But what's most important about this little anecdote is that this work is based exclusively in relationship. I have been, as a settler, I've been invited into this work very, very fortunately to work with Dr. Tatiana Degay. And this means that we have like an accountability framework that we have to work within in order to actually collaborate on this co-creation of knowledge. So that's a bit of the story of this story. And for what's most important in this work is another Edelman story. Now, I've gotten permission to tell this story from Tatiana and her community. These sort of paradoxes of Indigenous ways of knowing and doing paradigms of Indigenous ways of knowing and doing are really important to respect, like these sort of legal orders. And so with that said, I'd like to tell you a story that I'd like you to just keep in the back of your mind as we're going through this work, as this is the story that has really made this work possible and that this entire project is sort of based around. So on the screen, you should see a picture of a raven. Excuse me. And in Edelman ways of knowing and doing, raven, his name is Kutka, and Kutka created Kamchatka. And so as Kutka created Kamchatka, he went around to all the different rivers and dropped off a son and daughter, and those people became Edelman people that then built their villages and their lives in Kamchatka. Eventually, Kutka leaves Kamchatka and moves north into Koryak territory and then eventually into Chichki territory. And then we don't know where he goes. I mean, there's plenty of raven stories on this side of the Pacific, but that's sort of the gist in the background of Kutk. Now, the story I'm about to tell you is about Kutk on the Tigil River, which is sort of in northwest Kamchatka. Now, Kutk one day, he needed to go out to get firewood. And so he loads up his dog sled and he goes on his way out. And on his way out, he needs to use the washroom and he relieves himself. Goes and gets some wood. And on his way back, his excrement had frozen into a beautiful woman who then waved him down. And so she waves him down and he pulls over the dog sled and he's a little flabbergasted. She says, "Oh, my brother is from the Koryak. I must have fallen off the sled when I was asleep, and he's long gone now. But Kutk, if you love me, like, will you take me home?" And so Kutk immediately dumps the wood off of his sleigh and he says, "Come on in." And they ride off to his house. Now, Edelman people at this time lived in pit houses, sort of half underground. And so he gets home and he starts yelling at his wife and kids to get out. And so they come out of the home and they see their father and husband kissing his own frozen excrement. And they think, "Oh no, he's lost his marbles again." So they get out and he goes back into his home. And he offers her to make some food for her. And she says, no, that's far too warm for me. Let's make love. And, Kutk is not one for wasting time. So he jumps into bed with her and she takes off her lacy shoes and he puts him sort of by like the flue. And she says, no, Kutk, you can't put your shoes there. Your wife will get jealous and steal them. Hang them above the bed. So he does. They make love and the shoes thaw out and stinking drops of excrement fall onto Kutk's nose. And he stops and he says, "Oh, what's that horrible smell? What's happening?" And his excremental bride looks at him and says, "That's your wife. She's throwing excrement at us because she's jealous." And they continue to make love until eventually they fall asleep. Well, when Kutk wakes up, his excremental bride has thawed out on him, and he is coated in this sticky clay-like substance that he cannot extricate his stink from. So he starts screaming for help, all pitifully, for his wife and kids. So they go and investigate and take a look at what's going on, and the smell in the house is so bad they cannot go in. And so they decide to instead to lower a rope to pull him out. And so as Kutk fastens this rope around him, he accidentally does it around his neck, and so when they pull him out, they nearly strangle their own father. Fortunately, he was okay, and he comes out and cleans himself off, and he apologizes, and he says, "I'm so sorry. This will never happen again." And so that's the story that, like, this whole research is really based around. And I just want you to sort of keep that in the back of your mind as we're talking about things here. Now, for our next slide, this is a draft of the work that Tatiana and I have been doing. And so, in a way, this map represents my own excremental bride, as I've attempted to filter Steller's words through Indigenous counter-cartography. And we'll get more into what all that means as we continue. And this is based on linguistic relationships between people and non-human kin. And so, really, when you look at this, it's just a bunch of lines and a bunch of words and some symbols and stuff. But really, how do we map those relationships? And how do we interrogate the colonial archive to read between the lines in order to find the words of Indigenous elders and knowledge holders that Steller recorded? And more importantly, how do we actually create a map that's rooted in Edelman ways of knowing and doing? How do we engage in those relationships, especially when we can't even go to that place due to the world events?
I think I remember you said that the very first time we met too, of how do we engage with a place we've never been to? And just before we go on, like that always, or when you said that before and you said it now again, it really struck me because there are so many places Right? Like there is that sort of that connection that we build, and there's places we can't connect with, right? Sometimes just literally that we can't get to. But there are these really integral ways that we sort of do connect. Um, and I know for at least in me, that's always been through stories. And that's one of the greatest joys I got. I don't know about you when you were going back reading, Liam, but when I went back to read some of these old journals, um, right, there's the straight up fact, we found such and such plant and it has these properties. But when you're reading it in the context of sort of the people that they met or the lives they were living, my own life parallels there. This is kind of one example that I pulled from it because I remember when I was reading his journal the first time, I uh, I I thought it was so cool because this is a plant that we have where I grew up. He was drawing, or this is a later on drawing of a black chokecherry, and he was talking about how Russians and Tartars they will use it to make something that's very similar to what we kind of have as like a house table wine. And for me, I thought that was kind of interesting because we have this as well. But when we pick it where we're from, you have to be careful. Same thing as the inside of the pit actually has a lot of cyanide in it. That's why it's called in English. It's why it's called a choke cherry. So you have to boil it off. But we never made wine with them. We grew up making syrup with them. And so even though I've never been to this place, I can suddenly start to connect sort of like the people that were there. But I'm also fascinated by the fact that they had these, the same plant in this case, but used it for something different. Um, and sort of more specific ones. So this is another plant that he's talking about in some of his journals. So Steller was talking about what the Russians called a windflower. And he was telling this story about how they would use it to treat blisters and all sorts of things like that, but they would also use it to evade military service. Right. So when you think about the sort of Russian expansion eastward, there's lots of different cultures that they're encountering. Not everybody is always super stoked to be part of a place. And so sometimes what people do is they would actually intentionally cut themselves and then they would make a poultice out of this and mix it with butter and put it on the wound. And that was a way that they could then get out of service, but then they would still heal and not get sick from it. And so on one hand, in this one paragraph, this one small story, we've learned about the medicinal properties of the plant. We've learned about some of the uses for it. We've also learned about what's going on culturally, right? The different power plays that are happening. And all of that comes from one little line there. And so these are stories, we can kind of place them in time. We can look at his journals and think about it that way. But how do we place stories like that in space? And so I know lots of folks out there, when you ask to define a map, I always think it's interesting when you go back and think about having someone, for you probably say, well, it's a picture or it's a drawing of somewhere I'm trying to get to or someplace I'm trying to find or a place I've already been, right? But really, a map is just a visual representation. And so when we think about how to communicate that to people, right? Really, it's a pictogram. It's a story of places that you've been or seen or maybe you want to go. But the point of it is, it's for your own retention, your own memory, but it's also to give that story or sort of to share that with other people. And so, we think about maps in terms of roads. But I mean, as a biologist, one that I think about a lot is in terms of ecosystems, right? So for folks remember this is a picture of different ecotones or biomes that you can find throughout Asia, mostly looking at Russia, right, in this case. And so it's just got very general polygon shapes, right? But as a biologist, I can look at this and I know that because I understand what's happening there, that these are not actually hard lines, right? Just because we're changing from forest to steppe with that perfect line, that doesn't actually exist. They are blending zones. There are places where these are just overgeneralizations. And so if you step out of your profession and into someone else's, how are you supposed to know what are the assumptions in that map and what are the things that are actually true, right? It's that same thing of how do you understand a place you haven't been before? If you've already been there, you know that, oh, that line isn't quite right or that river doesn't quite flow there, right? So that information is integral to where you come from and sort of the perceptions that you bring with it. And one thing I think is hilarious, but is such a perfect example of this, is on those really cool old maps of the world or mariners maps. If you look at the edges of the maps, or if you look out in the middle of the sea, there's always these big sea monsters, right? This one I couldn't help but pick because I thought it was hilarious. Right? But it's this notion that, one, that is a completely artistic representation. And, as urban myth and legend goes, the cartographers, the map makers who were doing this, they could only fill in information as much as they could. So we kind of understand that in terms of when the lines start getting weird and shapes don't really quite make sense. We know that now, that they're just making guesses. But even in artistic representation of filling in negative space on a map, so back in the day before we had the whole globe mapped out, they would just put sea monsters in all this void space, right, to kind of make up for it. And then as the edges sort of got filled in, when we're thinking about the globe, right, it became a different way. So even that, it's this sort of internal bias going into it, forgetting about their skill or anything like that. And so our own narrative, as much as whoever decided to draw this specific sea monster, leaches into our work. It leaches into how we see things, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's just something that we have to be aware of. And so for some folks, if you're looking at this map, map might first come off to look as a very strange butterfly, or right. But this is another example I want to give, is that even if we don't think about it as human bias, we can start to think about it as even just technicality. How do you do it? How do you show things? Right? Maps have so much power to shape the way that we see and understand things. So if you haven't put the pieces together yet, this is looking at our world, but it's looking at it with Antarctica at the center, right? Which normally in almost all maps, Antarctica is the thing that we chop up and say it doesn't matter if it's distorted, it doesn't matter if things aren't there. And as we sit and we watch our ice caps melt, right? And we think about our ice sheet on Antarctica. Is it the fact that it is out of sight, out of mind? It's our freezer downstairs, but our maps don't ever focus on it. Our maps always tear it apart so that we can make other things be clear, so that we can make other things be the center of focus. And so this is just a example of a bunch of different map projections that are possible. Some of them are silly, some of them are realistic ones that we use, like the apple one. That one's just for jokes. But it's just to give you that notion that the people behind those maps, they do have a lot of control and power over how we see things, right? And how we understand them, and what our eye focuses on, what our intentions focus on. And so I think that's there's a lot to be said behind that, and there's also a lot to deconstruct with that. And sort of what I've come to understand, at least at this point in this journey, is that has a lot to do with where we can go with counter-cartography. So, Liam, if I pass it back over to you, I think you're going to teach us about how you've gotten into mapping.
Sure. So now that we've sort of had a really good introduction into like interrogating mapping generally, I'd like to introduce you to another what my professor, Dr. Ansdahl, would say, like, as a root taxonomy. Where is this knowledge sort of rooted? And so the root taxonomy is the work that I do, is based in traditional use mapping. But before we get into that, I just would like to introduce you to a little quote by Nishman around his work defending the mosquito reefs. And in his work, he says, more indigenous territory has been claimed by maps than by guns. This assertion has its corollary. More indigenous territory can be reclaimed and defended by maps than by guns. And that maps backed by guns are the true way to alienate asserted territory. And so I think that this quote really exemplifies the importance of mapping and interrogating the way in which we map. So traditional use mapping is a Canadian context sort of style of mapping that is used to prove rights and title, or title and rights to the Crown, which is the Canadian government, for Indigenous nations, to prove that like this is actually their land and they actually are from here. And so on the screen, you'll see a document called Chief Carey's Moose. It's an older guidebook from around 2000. But this guy, Terry Tobias, sort of has done a lot of seminal work around actually how to do this mapping. So this is the sort of like backdrop of the training that I have in order to engage in this sort of mapping. And, mapping isn't all just fun and games. It isn't just like drawing lines on a map or whatever. There's a lot of work that goes behind it. And so as we interrogate how we map, we got to interrogate our data.
Before we jump to that, I just want to maybe clarify
Yeah,
for some folks. So I was going to ask
sure.
you, do you want to give some examples of traditional use mapping? Because it's a pretty broad statement. I can think of a couple. I know from kind of where I've been. Like an example for me would be like on Vancouver Island, where Liam and I both live right now. There's a plant called camas. So people mapping camas, it's a food source. That's one example I can think of. But can you think of any others that would be kind of helpful for people to see what we're talking about in that context?
Yeah, so this would be in the context of like hunting sites, trap lines, old village sites, um, sacred sites. And so the purpose of traditional use mapping is to sort of like map out these activities and then make them visible to the state in order to prove to the state that Indigenous nations actually have rights and title to those territories.
Yeah. And I will go on and say it. I think it's ridiculous. I mean, that we have to go back and prove in reverse for them to say, yes, you've been here before. Not, it's like before they changed the law that you were guilty and then you had to be proven innocent. It's the equivalent of that to my mind,
Yeah.
which I think is terrible. But yeah, there is a whole bunch of work that goes behind these things. And we're now looking at some of your spreadsheets, Lord save us.
Oh, spreadsheets. So as Tatiana and I began to engage in this work, we started to basically try to figure out how to categorize the data that we see in Steller's account of Kamchatka. So how do we put the spreadsheet into a space? And what ended up happening in our first draft of this is that we turned an entire book into a spreadsheet. Not
What do you
super
mean by
useful.
that?
We basically copy and pasted various lines from the book into a spreadsheet and then tried to analyze them. We tried to put different codes and stuff on them, and it made this really bloated, ugly, frankly, unusable spreadsheet.
what, what do you mean by codes?
So in traditional use studies, typically you'll have like a subsistence site. And so, for example, that would be a place where maybe you harvest caribou or you go hunting for foxes to get fur and stuff. And so we would be applying these sort of like what is effectively arbitrary codes onto this data in order to like better understand it, to ask it. So yeah, does that make sense?
Yeah, so kind of, I guess like kind of grouping like with like. Is that
Yeah,
the
yeah, yeah,
notion there?
exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
Okay.
Um, so yeah, it became bloated and basically unusable. And we went to go and try and map it. It became really difficult. And the reason why is because we're not trying to make a traditional use study map. This is not in a Canadian context. We're not trying to prove rights and title. In the work that we do, it's assumed. Not only that, we're not trying to map to make things visible to the state. We're trying to actually map relationships, both between humans and non-human kin. So that would be spiritual aspects as well as like animals, fish, birds, etc. And so this sort of interrogation of our data structures led us to different drafts. And so if we take a look at the next slide, we have another
I see
spreadsheet,
more
which is
colors.
it's so much prettier. But again, these sort of categories that are here are still rooted in traditional use studies. And so in this final version, I really tried to embody a lot of the teachings that I've been gifted and stopped fretting over the data structures and stopped fretting over how a spreadsheet looks and what it actually, means, and just get mapping. Just do it. Let's stop getting bogged down by the spreadsheet and let's just get some points on a map and just see what it looks like. And so this didn't really work. It didn't work the first time. And so this is where we can introduce a concept of story work that Joanne Archibald, her seminal work from 2008, Indigenous story work, really came into a really good guiding principle for us. And so I've been reading all these stories and all these stories and all these stories and trying to figure out how do I map these stories in a good way and what does that look like? And as I started to map, I started to use the spreadsheet a little bit less. I stopped filling in as much unique site IDs, indigenous place names, and English translation, site use and description, and I just started using the quotes. And so in doing so, I was able to read these stories, which was just a blessing in and of itself. And so through those stories, we were able to actually interrogate this legacy of like basically this data structure. So having Kutka's stories as a methodology interrupts a classical way of structuring data, using things like informant codes, site type codes, and even site numbers that we decided not to use. While it's traditionally good data management practice to give sites codes, they're ultimately utilized by colonial methodologies to categorize and quantify and understand these places, but they also present a paradigm of divorce. So that is actually divorcing the real meanings of these places from the people that actually give them meaning. And so I are.
Oh, sorry.
Please. Go ahead.
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off there. The timing without the visuals is trickier. Just as you were saying that, so just for folks, I know we've been looking at the spreadsheet for a while, but there's two parts to this that I want to say. The first was just that it's not very often we get to see under the hood of how these decisions or choices are made. And so while we all usually see the map on the other side, this I think is such a cool chance to see the decisions and these trigger points that are happening on sort of the quote unquote inside of the map. And so Liam was talking about divorcing these ideas. And one of the things that really threw me, but I didn't even realize that I'd been sort of taught to think this way, for those who study science, or right, when we think about the sciences, we think about them as biology, chemistry, physics, math. That's how you split things up, right? Those are our ologies. And some of the First Nations that I've gone and worked with have split it up where the groups that you like, the way that they study a thing is these are the things that fly, these are the things that grow from the ground, these are the things that flow. And when you do that, the rock is in the same category as right your tree or things like that. And so all of a sudden the entire way that you group things changes how you will see them. And so, as you're reading through these titles of like unique site ID, right? Imagine if you were given a blank slate, how would you have grouped these, right? Because we try to have these systematic things, but those systems at the same time as they do group things, they actually cut off connections to something else. And I couldn't help myself. Sorry, Liam. I just wanted to throw that in there before we left this slide.
No. It's perfect. And so to build off on that, in adding these codes, why are we imposing these sorts of codes and these names and stuff when there's already a system that's in place there? There are place names that are here. So why would we call it, JWS3 or JWS3 site 3 whatever when it actually has a name, and I think that us as researchers and people living on these territories, if we can learn like the imposed name or these other coded names and stuff, I feel like we can learn the indigenous names for these places just as easily. And so in this, we're also practicing sort of and prioritizing indigenous knowledge systems and practicing indigenous data sovereignty by not reducing these relationships and understandings to a code. And ultimately, if we do strive to take us a step further and indigenize our data, we should actually be using and practicing these place names that we're lucky enough to learn. So now that we're done looking at spreadsheets, I promise that's the last one. I just wanted to give you folks the context. So I don't use GIS, not because it's traumatized me or anything, I swear. I use Google Earth Google Earth Pro. And so I just wanted to present to you folks how Google Earth sees Kamchatka from this sort of top-down, north-south sort of perspective. And then I just overlaid as close as I could Steller's version of Kamchatka. And so we can see here that, the proportions aren't right, but, for like the 1700s, it was pretty good. And then if we take a look at the next slide, we've got, what I've done is I've tried to read that map as best as I could and just sort of map out a general area that Steller actually mapped out there. And so we can see that the shapes are a little bit different. So these ways of mapping look entirely different than Kutka's map. We don't see any polygons here. We see a lot of lines. We see a lot of points. We see a lot of names, not that there aren't in Steller's. But, if there's one thing that Steller did is he gave a really rich account, despite his problematic perspectives. And from Steller's account here in the Edelman community, songs and dance are already being revitalized because his descriptions are so rich.
Sorry,
and
so you're saying that people are coming back and from the stories, they're pulling out information from their past? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
That's impressive.
Yeah, and then bringing life back into those practices too. So if we continue to engage in Archibald's principles of story work, which include things like reciprocity and respect and reverence, so holding these stories in reverence, we begin to instead of look at story as like working, using stories and using story work, but rather working with stories and having these stories actually have agency. And what does that look like, especially in like a cartographic sort of spiel? And so if we take a closer look here, we can see that this is just a sample of the data that's exemplified in Steller's work here. And again, I just want to revisit the Kutka story that I started at the beginning here and remind you folks that this sort of represents Kutka's excremental bride in that I've co-created this with Tatiana. And despite the fact that, I've done my best, I hope that, in case I do cover myself in my own sort of excrement, that the community will send a rope down and help me out and send me on the right path. But again, like, how do we do that? How do we interrogate this colonial archive? How do we create this map that's rooted in Edelman ways of knowing and doing? And ultimately what we opted to do, as you can see here, is not use polygons. So just in the same way that these sorts of like codes present paradigms of divorce, so too do polygons. And polygons are just like the shapes on the map that we see, where we see these like fun little borders between places. And especially in traditional use mapping, using polygons is a really good way to like divide and conquer. And so this creates like contested boundaries between nations. And so in this map, we opted not to do that at all. So this map is ultimately for Edelman people. And so what we've decided to do is take a cue from the stories that Steller records. And so if you remember before, I mentioned that Steller records that Edelman people sort of were dropped off at every river. And he records that at almost every river, there's a different dialect. And so what I opted to do was map some of the major rivers and use this as as like the tantamount linguistic relational sort of hub, if you will, where I would place points on the map. And that what this does is it sort of implies when we don't see things on a map, drawn on a map, it looks like it's empty space. And so by drawing these rivers and saying this is sort of the general area that people are hanging out in, it implies rather that these rivers or this blank space is actually fully quote unquote occupied and being used and being lived in. You'll see a lot of lines around here, and these lines are the linguistic relationships that Steller recorded. So every single one of those lines is effectively either a name or a relationship for a place or another group of people. And the different colors represent different people. So for example, the blue is the Koryaks. And so all those blue lines that are coming out from there, you can see are what Koryaks name different places or name different people. Let's see.
So just want to clarify that because I find it kind of fascinating. I think about how that happens in other maps too. So you said it's the names that they have for other people. So the example that came to mind for me was like Holland and the Netherlands. They call themselves the Netherlands, but on a lot of our maps and older maps, it's Holland, but like that's our name for it, not theirs.
Yeah. Yeah, or like Germany, Alemania. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, there's lots of
So
examples
again,
for that.
whose knowledge is reprioritizing here, right?
Right.
So one of the really difficult parts about this map was also mapping non-human relations. So again, these are spirits and animals and such. And so if we take a little bit of a closer look, we can see on slide 27 that we've got to zoom in on the mouth of the Kamchatka River. And so this is one of those hubs that I was talking about. So we can see mouth of the Kamchatka River, we can see a number of lines coming through, and that thick blue line is just an outline of the Kamchatka River itself. And it looks like there's a bunch of like really dense points. And again, around here, it looks pretty blank, right? But when you hover over this map, and you scroll your mouse over, you can see that it explodes into a rich web of relationships between people and non-human relations. And so we've used the Edelman and the Indigenous names for places where we can, where it's actually recorded. But this web really represents that sort of like hub based in Edelman ways of knowing and doing. And so this sort of relational paradigm is tantamount in this methodology in Kutka's counter-cartography. Yeah. So I see that we are coming up to the end of time here. And so I just wanted to leave you folks with another little story here. And so this is a story that I'm currently working with Tatiana to create a little film with around a place called Uyakojach. And so between Gretchen and Inikov, who is Steller's student, and Steller's account here, we were able to actually figure out how to pronounce the name of this island. And so in this, Steller talks about this island, Uyakojach, originally being where Lake Kurile is in the south of the peninsula. And he was so big and tall that he was shadowing out all the other mountains, and he got bullied so bad to the point where he decided enough was enough, and he made his escape and walked away. And as he walked away, he left this trail behind him, which became the Bolshaya River, and now is this sort of lonely volcano out in the middle of the ocean. But before leaving, they left their heart. And so you can find an island in the middle of the lake, and you can find the heartstone there still to this day. And so part of why I wanted to show you this as well is to show you like just how simple and realistically this mapping is. All that's there is the reference. It's the quote and a comment on just like how I managed to triangulate the place. And so in this way, we're really trying to let these stories speak for themselves and find their own agency, and ultimately to have these stories meet you where you're at. And you'll pick up things from them depending on where you're at, and you'll put things down as well. And so finally, you can see sort of, again, these relationships that are spanning across this map, both through line, and then I tried my best to, at certain points, to have this perspective either from an eagle's eye or as if you were coming in from the water. And so as a co-author, how do we reciprocate to these stories? How do we actually engage in good relationship both with these stories and the people that have shared them with us? And so in this way, if we think of like Kutka's Counter-Cartography and Kutka's story in the Teagle River as a co-author in and of itself, you know, so that's kind of the gist of it. Yeah.
I guess one of the questions I'm still sort of left with, Liam, is who are you making these maps for?
Sure. So this map isn't for me. I'm very lucky to be engaged in this work. However, this map is for Edelman people. This isn't, again, if we look at traditional use study mapping, this isn't for the state. This is for Edelman people to see themselves in their own landscape where they can, and to pick up sort of where their elders left off. Because a lot of these stories are recorded in like the colonial archives and are lost in community quite often. Not all the time, but quite often. And so, yeah, that's who this is for.
That's some pretty great work. And,
Yeah.
well, I'm gonna bring us to a close there. Thank you for sharing your work, Liam. And yeah, I know it's been since you and I have started sort of talking and working together, it's reshaped even in my own research how I started to see things. And yeah, I don't know. It's just a good reminder, I think, how important the stories are, where they come from, and how we carry them forward. I think this is such a cool way to re-envision that, and to reconnect it for people who, you know, in some way, or I mean, for everyone involved, but you know, it's almost like those lost stories, right? How to reconnect that. So thank you so much, and I will pass it back to you, Rob.
All right, thank you so much. Now, before we start with the question and answer session, I'd like to remind everyone that you can submit your questions via the question field in your control panel. So let's get to some of these questions. So is the sea cow, is that like a modern manatee?
So yeah, they would be kind of in the same family or in the same group, but yeah, it would be more, what's the other one? The dugong. That would be the closest sort of living relative, but it would be like a different cousin that evolved on a much different branch. Um, and in Steller's journal, the first thing he wrote about them, when you go through to read it, was that they were so plentiful that they could sustain all the ships coming through. And it was almost like that very first sentence damned the whole species, because they were touted as this easy to hunt, easy to catch, high food, even tasted good, which at the time living out in sea wasn't always a big thing. Apparently, the journal said they tasted like veal, um, and that pretty much led to their demise in less than 40 years, which is pretty wild to think about, at the rate of extinction.
Great, thank you. So on one of the slides, there was a quote that said something like, "Maps backed by guns are the true way." Do we know what that full quote is?
I have it somewhere deep in my notes, but yeah, that's not quite the gist of the quote there. So it says, "Maps backed by guns are the true way to alienate asserted territory." And so that is to say, like colonial maps backed by things like police forces or military forces are a way to alienate territories depending on who owns them. So in this case, if we think of like Coastal GasLink, for example, having the police in there is a way of alienating people from their own territory.
Great, thank you for that. So, is it true? I'm not sure if this is quite on topic, but is it true that the Vikings used ravens for navigation?
Um, you know what? I will take a stab at this, Liam. Maybe, I do not know them necessarily using the thing about birds. They have been used on ships. It's a proximity to land thing, so that might have come up. As far as directly integrating ravens, yeah, ravens are also big in Norse culture. Liam, you got any guesses on that one? It's a bit of a wild one.
Good question. No idea.
Okay.
Well, thanks for taking a stab anyway. We appreciate it. Um, Now, somebody else asks a question. I'm not sure, again, if this is something that you guys can address, but how does a volcano just start in the middle of the ocean?
I can probably grab this one if you want, Liam, or you can take a stab at it.
No,
So
you go ahead.
yeah, so volcanoes can form in multiple different ways. When we're talking about our sea floor, what we're usually talking about is a thinning of our sea floor, and that can be from a few different things. So, or sorry, so thinning or uh, confrontation between plates. So what I mean by that is if you think about our Pacific Ocean, the reason why it's called the Ring of Fire is because we have a bunch of plates that all bang into each other. And when they bang into each other, one goes underneath, and just the pressure of forcing one down, it's not quite the right way to think about it, but it sort of heats it up and then springs a leak and forces magma through that'll eventually form a volcano. Places like the Aleutian Islands or Hawaii, those are a different story, which is what I'm guessing is Kamchatka's on the other side. So I'm not entirely sure if that's referring to continental plates, or what it can be is that you actually have a really hot spot of magma underneath. It's not all equal, it's not all evenly dispersed. And so that one hot spot will keep sending a plume up. But our plates are moving, right? Don't ever forget that. They're always banging against each other, right? So Hawaii is a string of islands because there's one hot spot or a couple small hot spots, and the island chain keeps moving, our plate keeps moving. And so again, this notion that this walked away is a very cool one, because it ties into sort of the history and the evolution of the landscape, but also potentially even carrying stories in the development of that mountain, or that volcanic mountain. So we have the same thing with stories of glaciation here, and that get tied into language, right? So there's a lot of these really big scale processes that are actually held in story by a lot of different indigenous cultures. And there's always a bit of irony when the science just proves what the story already said, I think.
Great. Thanks for describing that. We appreciate it. So, is there a particular book or a place that we can go to learn more about Steller and this and the map of how he journeyed to discover all these animals?
Yeah, there's a few different ones. As far as his time in the Bering Sea with Vitus Bering, you can go to, I think that's pretty much exactly what it's called. It's Journey with Bering 1741 to 1742. And then, Liam, I don't know which, I'm not sure the titles of the books that you were referencing.
Yeah, it's titled Stellar's History of Kamchatka.
Great. Thank you both. Unfortunately, that's going to be the last question that we do have for today. So I'd like to throw it back to you for any closing comments you may have for us.
Well, I'll say thank you everyone so much for joining. And while it might have seemed slightly out of context, I wanted to send the picture of our geese flying home. I'm losing all my words today. Uh, because when we think about finding our way, right, it's often birds that I'm very inspired by in their migration routes, and how they plan their paths forward. And I'm always kind of amazed of where they know where to go. And so I think about that as kind of how I try to navigate the world and making choices of where I go. And some of that's inherited, and some of it seems to be innate or instinctive. But I appreciate every time I stumble across someone new who can teach me to see it in a different way. So thank you everyone for joining. Thank you, Liam, for taking the time to share with us. And if there's anything you'd like to add before we sign off.
No, just thank you all for taking the time, and thank you for inviting me to share this really fun stuff with you. So, yeah, thanks.
Our pleasure.
All right.
Thanks, everyone.
And thank you both for taking the time to present for us today. And I'd also like to thank everyone who tuned in today. Now, if you are interested in information on how you can travel with NatHab, please give us a call at the number on your screen, or you can send us an email at info@nathab.com. Our adventure specialists are happy to help you out. Join us Monday for our next daily dose of nature. You can check out next week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. With that, I will conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody. We'll see you next time.